thanks everybody for joining. This is the 16th episode of Art of Law, Doing Tech in China. And I think this has been a kind of I guess an obvious topic, Mark, but we just never addressed it very directly. And I think it's going to be a very good one. But just some housekeeping stuff. Like I said, this is kind of our series that we like to record every once in a while, every 2 weeks actually. And our YouTube page is here, and everybody who's signed up or watching this will get a copy of the PDF presentation. So no need to worry about taking notes or anything like that. But the most important part is that feel free to ask any questions. We don't want this to just be a sermon. This is supposed to be kind of a way to kind of help you figure out how all of these topics relate to you. And like we normally do, Mark, I do like to kind of start off with a little bit of then and a little bit of now. So, Mark, I know that you were around during this time. I picked these pictures just because, this is Shujiahui. Anyone who's been to Shanghai knows about Shujiahui. And I think over here on, I'll use the pen here. On this side over here, there used to be, and there still is, a really big technology mall where they just sell computer parts. You can get your video games there, just anything tech related. But I picked it because it has the big Toto sign, the big Kohler sign. So coming from,
you're a bit of a toilet fan, are you, Sean?
I mean, the toilet technology for sure has taken off over the past 30 years. So I don't know, Mark, did you see this change happening, or is this?
I didn't go. I mean, I didn't go to Shujiahui that often. I never really liked it that much. But I think that's an old. I mean, obviously 2004, so Shujiahui looks very different. But where you look at the first arrow you put, I think I see the spire of the old Shujiahui church, and I remember there was like this article from the 80s where this guy was talking about going to this church. And I'm not religious, but I wanted to go to the church because it sounds so interesting. But I just didn't know where it was because it was talking about it being on the outskirts of Shanghai, far away from the city. And it actually turned out to be the Shujiahui Church, which I think a lot of people think it's downtown by now, Shujiahui. So I guess, in the last 18 years or whatever, 2004, that area has changed a lot as well. So it's an old photo. It should be a third photo, I think.
Yeah. I have another photo here of Nanjing East Road. Now, Mark, I know you were probably around during the 1930s, but a lot has changed too since then. Maybe for the people who don't know Shanghai, what is Nanjing East Road for someone like you, Mark, who's been around for so long?
Oh, it's something which you avoid at all costs. It's the place where people will come up to you and offer you massages or show you art exhibitions, or I think it's the stretch where tourists and foreigners get scammed the most. I think, so it's a pedestrian zone. Again, it's changed a lot. So I guess Nanjing Road is traditionally the big shopping street, and it still gets very crowded, but I don't know if many Shanghainese go there. I think it's mostly tourists, also Chinese domestic tourists. And I guess at the end of it, you end up at the Bund. But I think for most people who live in Shanghai, Nanjing Lu, best to avoid. I don't think people like going there.
That's the real Shanghai advice right there. But they don't sell many. It's not as like a technology shopping center or anything like that. But there, it is. But they do have some that you can check out there. So I guess I just wanted to pick your brain a little bit before we jump. And today's topic is quite in depth, Mark. So we can try to speed it along here. But just to get your point of view, how has Shanghai or China generally, changed technologically from when you arrived to today? Maybe we'll just start off with that first question.
Okay, so I think back in the I first got to China in the early 90s, 91 or 92, and I think you wouldn't have thought it's a very high tech society. And I think when I started working as a lawyer back in 94, I think it was, most of the projects that interested the Chinese partners were that the foreigner would bring cash. That was the first and foremost thing. That was the most exciting thing. But then technology was something which people were very interested in. And now I think, 25 years on, what we've seen is, and if you live in China too much, you often forget that technology marches on in Western countries as well. But you really see how China has embraced technology. And it's not to say that West doesn't have great technology and isn't doing stuff, but I think China's gone from being somewhere where there wasn't much technology to being an eager adopter of technology, and now I think it's an eager adopter but also an innovator. And in some areas, I think China is there are things that the foreign companies can learn from China, especially in things like interfaces with retail. I guess 5G, I'm not an expert in that area, but I see a lot. I remember I went to a department store in Australia, and about I don't know, it was about maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and in China, the online, it was really, I think already like 5 or 6 years ago, big companies which were doing like I forgot what they're called, the big box electronic retailers like Best Buy. And then there was Media Market. So Best Buy went into this big shop on Wahailu, and then they left after like 2 years. And then Media Markt, which was a German company, went in there with the same offering. And it was always busy, but it was busy with people taking photos of what they wanted to buy, getting the advice, and then buying it online. And when I went to Australia to this department store, I wanted to buy something. It was out of stock. And, I think their online response was to have somebody go in the back of the shop and see if something was lying around and say, no, it's not in stock. So I think in China, especially with mobile apps, mobile purchasing, e-commerce, live streaming, that kind of stuff you see a lot. And maybe Western companies can learn a lot from that. And that might be also where a non-tech business like retail has really just become a technology savvy type business.
Yeah, especially if it's those consumer facing businesses. But I think one of the other things, at least I'll just say this very quickly, I think for me was the adoption of electronic payment. I think that's one of the things that happened so fast in China, just paying with QR codes and things like that. But like just to echo what you said earlier, the appetite and the ability to just embrace technology. I think you told me a long time ago when I first joined, Mark, China kind of leapfrogged a lot of technologies. A lot of people not only in Shanghai but in China went from a landline to like a smartphone. So they skipped the whole beepers, car phones, a lot of these intermediary technologies. And so compared to the West, you'll see a lot more older people using smartphones, because that's kind of like, there was the landline straight to the smartphone. There wasn't all these other technologies. So, and I guess I'll just get to the last question here, Mark, because we got a really action-packed agenda here today.
Oh, wow, exciting.
Yeah. So what about the legislative trends? Because usually, the law tends to lag behind technology. And not only have you been in China for so long, but you've also been practicing here. How have you seen, the legal landscape adapt to that change?
Well, I think it's always been the same kind of thing. So I don't know if there were lots of differences. I think if you look at the technology stuff, it's always been encouraged. Early on, back in the early 90s, you could establish a company as a wholly foreign-owned enterprise, and they had two things which I don't think they ever checked in reality. And if it was approved at the local government level, no one cared. But it showed perhaps the thinking. And one thing was, if you were an export-orientated company, which I think was yet to export more than 70%, but like I said, nobody checked. So obviously, China has always been interested in exporting and bringing in cash and foreign exchanges. But the other thing was, if you were technologically advanced, which nobody really knew what that meant. So I think, they've always been keen to embrace it. I think China is maybe number 3 or 4 largest importer of technology. So even today, China imports a lot of technology. A lot of it's like license contracts, etc. I think, anything has been more pro-tech. So, there was early on this real goal to localize the technology, like in the auto industry, you'd have to localize production, localize technology. There were restraints. You couldn't, you'd have to allow the Chinese entity to make improvements. You wouldn't be able to fetter their ability to use the technology overseas. These things have been over time, stopped. Many people would say there's still a certain pressure to localize, but I think that's more through tenders and other things. So I think, it's all gone like that. I think for technology companies, we're talking about technology companies, I'd say the thing that we've seen in the last couple of years is data, which is probably a worldwide issue. But, privacy is an issue, cybersecurity is an issue, but also transferring data, even for business purposes, between countries is becoming a very hot topic, a very difficult topic. People don't know exactly what to do. And so I think this is a big challenge, but this isn't somebody trying to stop, China importing technology or collaborating. I think it's tied into cybersecurity, privacy concerns. Probably there is an element that China would like to have more R&D done in China, but I think it's a bigger topic than just that narrow hope to get the R&D reshored in China.
Yeah, and I think that there is there's a lot of growing pains everywhere, like you said, in terms of data, protecting privacy. It's not just a China thing, it's an EU thing, it's an American thing too. But generally, it is very encouraged. And we do have a couple episodes, if you want to check out the YouTube channel, on the Star Exchange, which is the China NASDAQ, which is definitely encouraging certain types of technology. So like I said, Mark, we have an action-packed schedule here today. So here's what we plan to cover. This is kind of, I guess, going to be like a crash course on tech businesses wanting to look at China or maybe expand in China. And we'll cover a couple issues: market trends, options, regulatory issues, such as your market access, what licenses do you need, and then we'll finish it off with some compliance and implementation, kind of touch on the data and cybersecurity, and a little bit of IP too. So we do have a lot here going on today. Maybe, Mark, well, just to set the scene, because I know we talked a little bit about back then and versus today, but so much has advanced in a short period of time. Maybe we take a finer look at some of the market trends recently.
Yeah, so I think that global digital. So I think China is not just being an adopter; it's becoming an innovator. And I think those ones we mentioned there in the digital space, e-commerce, fintech, AI, and high-tech manufacturing. I think in fintech, sometimes Chinese companies can become a bit snooty. They might say, "Huh, yeah, that fintech's not that exciting. We got better stuff." Like you mentioned, QR code. Of course, you can pay, in Europe with your smartphone for most things, and you can double click. I don't think, at least I haven't gotten the app, or like WhatsApp doesn't have that. At least I haven't worked out how to use it. The same, in China, where you don't take your wallet. I mean, I didn't have my wallet for 3 months in China. I always just had my phone with WeChat and Alipay. I don't think there is that level of that. You can use your smartphone, but it's either linked to Apple Pay or it's linked to your debit card or something. So I think China is going fast there, but I think it still has a lot of interest in, especially the high tech manufacturing, the AI, semiconductors, of course, which is a bit sensitive. that, there's a lot of areas where China's got stuff which it could export, but it still remains very interested in bringing in tech. And I think one thing which we haven't mentioned here is there's all these new companies on the Star Exchange who are raising a lot of capital in China, getting valuations as high as the US or even higher. And so I think my guess is they'll be interested to tie up with foreign companies because they're going to be looking for things to roll out in China. So that's kind of interesting. Urbanization, it's interesting for us because one of our areas is mobility, and smart cities probably really tie into mobility. And so, China really has set up so many big cities and so densely urbanized. And so I think, this will really be the place where you can roll out, environmental protection stuff. You can roll out, smart car type options, electrification. While in the West, you notice many people are discussing different ideas how you will power electrical cars. Probably in China, they'll go with something like a, fuel cell replacement type thing, just to make it faster. And the Chinese government is able to roll things out. So that'll get adopted. And I guess China will really, by dint of the size of its domestic market, it probably will set global standards for some things, or battery companies will probably have to adopt the way that the Chinese do it, because they'll probably be quicker and more resolute as to the option chosen. I think the international. Sorry?
Would you say that the Greater Bay Area is one of those kind of projects?
Well, no, I think the Greater Bay is. I think, there's all those big cities. The Greater Bay probably has there's a lot more, attention paid to it, and tech companies happen to be setting up there. I don't think that was really because of the policies. I mean, if you look at near our office in Shenzhen, I've forgotten what it's called, but there's a area where there's something like 15 of the top, listed companies on Star Exchange, and 10 cents there. 10 cents starting a city I read somewhere in Shenzhen, which will be totally without needing cars. So I don't think there's these guiding policies, but I think Shenzhen, for example, is seen as this new kind of thing where they're experimenting with other things, not so much tech, but rule of law and things like that. And then I guess if you combine it with Hong Kong, really it could be in 20 years, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, and these other surrounding cities might form this massive, big megalopolis city where people can travel freely. So yeah, I think a lot's happening in Greater Bay. I don't know if there's any particular technology incentives or anything there which is better than elsewhere. I guess the international expansion with the trade war and the tech war and all these kind of stuff, and people bring out these laws which they say are not about China, which I guess because the fact that they say it's not about China means it is about China, and stifling Chinese investment in things that they consider, sensitive. I've got the feeling that there's bumps in the road, but I think China's just now too big, too interconnected. I think it's a bump. I think there will be some, accommodation. The pendulum will swing back, but probably there will be tech companies that will have a Western tech plan for like the US and Europe, and maybe in China, they will find a partnership and that tech may evolve in a different way. But I think, China's just too big to ignore, and Chinese companies will want to go global, and global companies need to be in China. So there'll be things that will happen. And then I think the guiding policies, Belt and Road, you don't hear that much about it anymore, but that's still ongoing. China 2025, again, I think they don't mention it too much because it makes other countries a bit nervous. But I think, I think it still means that China looks for growth. It looks to build its indigenous technology, and it wants to keep on going up the value chain in tech-related stuff and become an innovation economy. So I guess the policies continue to point in that direction.
Yeah. I mean, so a lot of those, fair to say, a lot of those were not around 30 years ago, 27 years ago when it came. But I guess the question still remains though for tech companies is, well, what licenses do I need, if any, to operate in China? And I think that's, it's probably the question that you hear the most, Mark, probably, I guess, for tech companies who are looking at China. I guess we could separate this into a couple different buckets. The next few slides are going to be centered around this question, which is, not, as you may correctly assume, is not very straightforward to answer. But I guess we can start here though, Mark. Maybe we can start with first with VATS licenses, but then maybe after that, ICP licenses and ICP filings. People may have heard about these things, but maybe it's better that we just clear it all up now.
Okay, I don't know if we can clear it all up, but we'll do our best. So I think, yeah, firstly, like tech companies, their first question isn't normally about the operational licenses. The first question will be, can I protect my IP in China? But that will be something we can discuss another time. Second question is there a market in China for our tech? Some things will not work in China. Some things will be off limits as well, like, super unbreakable encryption is probably off limits. So I think they're probably the gating questions. But once people look at it, and a lot of people don't think about it, is, well, if I'm going to operate in China, so it's really the operational thing. And so sometimes people will come here and they will set up something just with a business scope in their business license that looks like, okay, I can do kind of what I want to do. And these things do happen. But if you're a digital company, a VATS license is a value-add telco service license. And so that will be almost anybody who is doing something on the internet where there's a certain amount of commercial, so they're making money off the internet. It could be streaming, it could be voice over IP. It's surprising, how many digital companies will be caught by that. So I think there's many different types of VATS licenses, and some are off limits to everybody. Some are off limits to wholly foreign owned enterprises, but are possible for joint ventures. Some are possible for joint ventures in the law, but impossible in practice. So I think you'd have to analyze your business model, see what VATS licenses you need. In some cases, you can avoid it if you've got a free service and you somehow have a different business model. So we've got a client looking at it, and that would be a way for them to enter the market before getting the VATS license if they're doing some kind of free service. Aligned to the VATS license is the invoicing, which is really a big hassle and a big problem. So it's not like a consulting company. So if you're doing some kind of digital service, really, the thing where people really fall down is they don't work out the invoicing in advance. And then they can't issue the right kind of invoice and all that kind of stuff, complicated. ICP license, ICP filing, there's a big difference, like an internet content provider. So the ICP license, if you have that, then like Alibaba, you can sell products of third parties, you can do all kinds of things. Very difficult to get, almost impossible, I think. The ICP filing is the opposite. That's just meaning that you've got a website. And I think you can get that in one day by just online registration. So ICP license, almost impossible. ICP filing, very easy. But this doesn't stop us seeing somebody every 6 months trying to sell a client a woofie that holds an ICP filing and pretending it's some super difficult to obtain document and it's worth millions. So, check what you need, but that's the licenses. And it will have a very close link to the business and also your invoicing and who your clients are.
So we put here just a list of the VATS licenses. It may look pretty straightforward, but like Mark said, it can get quite hairy once you start delving into some of the the details, especially because sometimes, like you mentioned, Mark, sometimes one product can touch multiple different VATS licenses. So it does require a little bit more thought. So I guess the question after you figure out, what type of licenses you might need, well, the question I guess is, well, you usually will need some type of VATS license, but it may not necessarily be so, depending on how you enter China. So you have here a couple of different options, Mark, and you touched on this first option a little bit earlier when you're discussing about invoicing and things like that. But the first option is just operating completely offshore. Mark, maybe you want to give us what does this mean?
Yeah, and it's also worth mentioning that photo, they are actually my legs. So just yeah. So I think we've got a lot of clients who are doing, and I guess unfortunately when we're talking about tech companies today, we're mostly talking about digital companies. But of course, there's tech companies who are doing, pig farms with lots of tech and things like that. But I guess what we're thinking about mostly is people that got like a service or something that is performed digitally via the internet, because that's what we're seeing a lot of. And so let's just say if you've got an education, like EdTech's a big thing, you might have, I don't know, a language teaching service, and you might be very successful overseas. Many of those kind of companies would operate offshore. And so, they would be happily going along. They're not probably exciting enough for the Chinese to attack the website, or the Great Firewall won't block that website. But what they will find is they'll have difficulties in getting renminbi sales, because you really need to have renminbi sales to drive sales. So they'll probably rely on people that got an overseas bank account, or got a credit card, and are willing to go on the hassle of paying that amount of money. It will kind of block you out. So let's say you're a language school, you're teaching, I don't know, French, business French to people. It won't really let you do deals with large Chinese schools or vocational schools or something, because you won't be able to invoice locally in renminbi. If you try to do that, you'll be very reliant on the local PRC distributors and how to deal with them. And then, also, if you're really operating offshore, then you're not going to be able to do any market or sales support. So if you do have a problem with your product, or your service, that's all difficult. I mean, what it's interesting is, very few of those clients that we've got, there's a few exceptions, but mostly they've already started doing this, and they're surprised by how many sales they've got. They might have a couple of Chinese local distributors, and then once they set up, they will look to get VATS licenses. But quite a lot of them, it takes a long time to decide to do all this. And they really build the Chinese business just by having a simple woofie, providing marketing and sales support, and building up a network of local PRC distributors. So I guess, that's the first option. One thing I would say is you still have to be a little bit careful if you're going to be operating somewhere which has very sensitive data. So if you got like an overseas, if you're going to be dealing with things like iron ore capacity, or trading information, or lots of Chinese people's personal data, you may be in trouble even if you operate offshore. So just be a bit careful about that.
And if this was dipping your toes into the water, I guess option 2 would be to actually setting up your business. So what would be I guess what would be some of the major advantages of setting up your business versus just completely operating offshore, Mark?
Well, I think for most of them, like most have the dream, and most of the ones we deal with will want to set up. They want to move in and do something, but they're not really sure what they want to do, and they want to base. And technology companies in particular can be very busy. We know one technology company, which is a really big one. They set up their wholly foreign owned enterprise. That took them like a long time, and then it took them like another 6 months to hire the first person. I think the first person left before they entered the office. So, you know, yeah, technology companies are often easily distracted. So I think, you know, a lot of them, once we've gone through the whole, you know, thing with them, and because China's a big market, people are treading cautiously. So there's a lot of discussion. There's the board is involved, senior management's involved. And so I think many people will say, let's go with a wholly foreign owned enterprise. And this might just do some marketing and consultancy. And they might even have the idea of a VIE add-on, which I'm sure is coming up. But really, most of them, few have done it, but most don't even get to the VIE stage. They kind of continue. I think the VIE will come, but they'll just build up their marketing, their onshore service, and build up their working with the distributors. The advantage of the wholly foreign owned enterprise compared to the joint venture is, you know, it's less likely to be of a conflict, but in some cases, you might need a joint venture or you might need a different solution. So a lot of people will do it. It's a low cost, easy way to do something, but it's probably not the end game.
Yeah. And we will get on VIE. First, we just talked about joint ventures. So like you mentioned, Mark, that sometimes you might, the situation might necessitate a joint venture. So we've talked a lot about joint ventures before in the previous episodes. But in regards to tech, what do you mean that some situations might require a joint venture?
Well, sometimes you need it. I mean, like, there might be the legal restriction, which can be the case. So like I said, some things you need a joint venture to get that license. You could do the VIE, which we'll talk about in a minute, but it might be in a very sensitive area where you think, I'm not going to get away with it. You know, even though VIEs are not, you know, illegal, but you might be somewhere where it's just too clearly and too prominent that you might say, this is not the kind of business that we can operate this way. You might say, I want a Chinese investor. It's going to be expensive. I can have a small operation in Shanghai or Beijing, or I could roll this out nationally. Or there's a Chinese partner who's great. You know, we have this Chinese software company looking with a European health provider company. The project hasn't stalled, but I think it was an interesting idea. You know, basically the joint venture was going to, you know, be launched in China. Chinese investor would have taken, or the Chinese company would have done most of the investment, taken care of most of the things. But the Chinese software company was more interested in building med tech, and the Europeans were interested in, you know, being along for the ride. So that's kind of interesting. So both of them were going a bit out of their comfort zone, and, you know, doing something, you know, in this, you know, new market for them all. I think PE and VC deals, there's a lot of those things now happening. Like China, like I said, you know, it's not just technology that's now being created in China. There's a lot of cash, and there's a lot of PE companies, a lot of VC companies putting money into it. A lot of PE and VC companies putting money into, you know, VIE structures of Chinese domestic companies overseas. You know, or you might be doing a technology license with them, and then you might say, why don't I do a joint venture? So I think most companies that we see now, it won't be the strict old negative list. You need a majority Chinese shareholder, but it might be how to penetrate the Chinese market, get the Chinese investment, or you just think it's easier with a Chinese partner. Let's say you want to set up 10, you know, high-tech hospitals in China. Legally, you're able to do that now, I think, as wholly foreign owned enterprise in a number of pilot cities, but you're not going to be able to roll it across 150, you know, cities. You're not going to be able to deal with the problems that a hospital would do on a day-from-day process. So I think that's the reason. And of course, like we always say, the most important thing is getting the right joint venture partner. So, you know, that's how comes and falls.
And, you know, we were talking a little bit from a tech context, but, you know, with the joint venture, you can check out some of the previous episodes, but it also comes with the baggage of just being in a joint venture too. So, you know, exit it being a problem as well. So we have here some, you know, the VIE, which I think a lot of people may have heard about, but the VIE can be kind of a flexible solution to not having the commitment, the marriage of to your joint venture partner, but still being able to apply for some of these VATS licenses or any other types of licenses that may be required. So, Mark, can you give us like the general overview of what is a VIE and how does it work exactly?
Yeah, so for a VIE for a company coming into China, VIEs are also for Chinese companies who want to go abroad and list overseas. But just very briefly, because it's complicated, we don't have that much time today. Basically, let's say we have that education company that wants to do online learning, teaching or whatever, and let's say they need like a couple of VATS licenses. So what they might do is they might set up a wholly foreign-owned enterprise that they can own, that can hire the employees, it can do certain contracts, it can do some consulting itself. But then for the business, which is off limits, where you need a certain type of VATS license, then that business would be done by a local entity. And then that local entity is not a foreign invested local entity, but rather it is a trusted PRC nominee, Chinese citizens. Might be your employee. Many cases, people don't use their employees anymore because they're more likely to get into trouble than anybody else with you. So it could be a third party that is disinterested. And so then basically there's different contracts where the local entity holds the licenses and does what it has to do, and the wholly foreign-owned enterprise gets the money and things like that through a series of contracts. So we see this much more than you think. People don't publicize it because it isn't something which people want to publicize, but it is a relatively common feature of the tech landscape in China.
And here, I'll get to your question, Cyrus, but option 4.1, the VIE plus WFOE. Now, it is kind of important to mention that these options, you can mix and match. I know that, we do have some clients, Mark, that we have WFOEs and JVs all happening at the same time. So this option 4.1 for people who are kind of new to VIEs is kind of a VIE plus WFOE model. How does that usually work, Mark?
Well, I think that's how I just mentioned it. I mean, so basically the WFOE will do what it can do to the maximum amount, and then the VIE will just deal with the day-to-day stuff. And this is the way to get the funds, because if you just have the VIE, I don't know how you get the funds offshore. Or you could through a service license, but it would be a very risky thing to do. So
yeah,
all of these things have a VIE plus a WFOE.
It could also be, in addition to financing, it could also be protecting IP. That might be one other reason why you want to separate a lot of these joint ventures and WFOEs so that the Chinese partner doesn't have, access to everything. So like I said, I'll send a PDF of this to everybody so you can always take a look. But we put here just a very short summary of the different options, and you can take a look at it at your leisure. And also very quickly, applying for a VATS license, it's pretty straightforward process. But like I mentioned, there are many different types of VATS licenses, and there are local offices or national offices that you need to worry about too. But generally, you apply for your account online, you submit the application, the office, the authority that's dealing with your application may want to see more supporting documents, or they may just accept it. And once they do, you get a notice of acceptance, and then after that, at the very end, you'll get your decision with whether you've been approved or not.
I think it's never ever been that simple in real life, but anyway.
Yeah, generally this is the way it's supposed to be. It sounds, when you lay it out like this, it sounds pretty straightforward, but in real life it is quite messy. And I think Cyrus from the chat had, we're going to move on to the cybersecurity and some of the data issues, Mark, and IP. But Cyrus's question was very relevant to this. So in his question is, how far in practice has removal of forced technology transfer changed the Western mindset? China market entry or strategy? Is localization at least a precondition for investment?
Yeah, I think I don't think that's the case anymore. I mean, of course, it's a big country, lots of different areas. I think it's moved away. The poster child of forced technology transfers was always the automotive industry and localization content, etc. I think if there is the case where there's still not really forced technology transfers because that's not legal, but where we still see it is in certain industries where the tenders require you. So if you want to sell to a state-owned company, uh, you know, you need to have a joint venture or be a domestically owned company. One example, which I happen to know, is in the rail business. So if you want to sell to the, and that's dominated, I guess, by state-owned companies. So some people are really required to go, and then sometimes the tenders may still require certain local content, but at least they might require joint ventures, or in some cases even wholly Chinese-owned company. We're just talking yesterday, a company wants to exit the China market, and their former distributor might want to buy the company, and the main reason is he wants to buy it and then be able to sell to large state-owned companies because they're currently held out of those markets due to tenders. So that kind of stuff is still happening, but I don't think it's like in the old days when they brought the Transrapide to China, that magnetic maglev train, where there was the forced technology transfer of local content, and then the surreptitious going into the thing and copying the technology. I think that's not really happening that much anymore.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing about Cyrus's question was that what we have here on the slide is there's just this huge disconnect. So what we have here is the concerns from lawyers and journalists in the Western media about what is what they think are the key concerns from the new cybersecurity law, data privacy laws, and then what we have here all by itself in the corner of the page is kind of what you were talking about, Mark. Is for the average business, what are the real concerns that they should be worried about? And so, maybe this is is this what you were talking about, Mark, when is Cyrus's question kind of like the first thing that, people do think about is how can I protect my IP? Is this like, is this slide kind of going to that idea of, they're going to I have to give my source code out, or, all of these other types of concerns? Is that usually what you hear?
Yeah, I mean, not usually. I mean, I think it really depends. Tech's a big area. Technology is a big area. So with source code disclosure, if you want to sell to a bank and if your, product or service could lay waste to the Chinese banking system, you're going to have to disclose the source code. You're going to have to do a security assessment. I think a lot of people do get, overly worried about it. It won't affect most companies most of the time. It might affect you. You might need a security assessment if you want to sell to large state-owned companies, which you might not have guessed, like say energy companies, because, they need to be secure, because if somebody hacks their records, that could really affect, the purchase price. And China imports a lot of energy. So it's it is a national security issue to make sure that pricing is, dealt with in a secure way. So I think some people are very worried about PRC government access to data, and that could be high-tech companies. It could be people about Chinese users using their stuff, like Tesla, is onshoring that kind of data. People get upset about it. Chinese citizens, I think, I can't speak for them, of course, or for all of them. Nobody can speak for all of them. But I think, the average Chinese citizen probably trust their government to deal with data much more than the average citizen in the West. And Western companies are very worried. So I think there is often a dilemma, a dynamic where, somebody in a company in China says, it's no problem. It's just the PRC government is going to get access to this data. And the, legal department in the West will say, this is a problem. The PRC government will get access to the data. I don't think it's it's probably not as fantastic as what the Chinese employees say, nor is it as problematic as the overseas people are making it out to be. This can be in such varied areas as, a media company, but it can also be like a chemical company that's bringing a new ingredient for cosmetics. They'll have to disclose the formulations to a degree, to the NMPA. Some companies seem to think the NMPA will then do a side deal with the Chinese cosmetic companies. So I think it's, difficult. I think it's something, where people have to talk. Cross-border data transfers, that really does seem to be a big problem. And there's lots of new laws coming out. It's going to be a bit of a headache, how to deal with it, because I think there's unforeseen, unintended consequences, which will make data transfers problematic.
Okay. You mentioned a little bit about data, Mark, but maybe we can just go over very quickly some of the key data issues that international companies coming to China need to familiarize themselves with.
Yeah, so I think here, if we're talking about like data for people, which is what most of the slides about, if you're GDPR compliant, you're pretty much good for China. Few little differences, but so the things are not over the top. It's just that there's been a lot of laws very quickly, whereas 10 years ago, I think there was no protection. So now it's increasingly protected, but it hasn't hit a European standard of privacy protection. So I think it's nothing to be overly concerned about, but you may need to consider how you transfer the data. You should see if you can get consent, see if you can anonymize it.
And like you said, Mark, if you're compliant for your home jurisdiction, I mean, a lot of this stuff is pretty, I guess, commonly accepted. Common standard now. In many countries. So here we have some good practices to keep in mind. Explicit consent is required. Limited scope principle. A lot of these are not new inventions. So if you are using these practices at home, you should probably just.
I mean, Americans might be different. I don't know anything about American data law, but I just know when the UK left European Union, immediately the social media companies like Facebook and all that, they changed their user agreements to exclude the protections for citizens under the European law. So America may not necessarily cover all these things. So that's why we talk about GDPR. We haven't actually, as far as I know, we haven't checked whether the US data laws protect people the same way as it.
Yeah, I think I don't know much about the GDPR, but it seems like that's probably the most strict standard. Yeah. So if you're compliant with that, then you should the Chinese data laws should also be okay for you. And I guess this is the slide that I'd rather take a little bit more time, Mark. We only have 10 minutes left. And we only have 10 minutes left, and there's only one more slide after this. But when I drew that squiggly line about what are the real concerns for your average business handling data. I mean, it doesn't even have to necessarily be a technology company. If you have an app or you're collecting data on your customers, these are the types of companies that we were thinking about. So what for these types of companies, what are some of the real concerns, that they should have with respect to the cybersecurity law, data laws in China?
So I think, so firstly, I think, for most companies, it won't affect most of their stuff. But if a key component of your market is the very large state-owned enterprises or the banking sector or critical infrastructure, like nuclear power plants or the power grid, the waterworks, all these kind of things, you're going to have to do a security check, I think. So that revenue may be at risk if you're not willing to, meet the Chinese halfway or meet them fully their way about whether you'll be able to sell to those kind of companies and to that sector. So I think that's the first two. There's those 7 key industries under cybersecurity law. And we talk about technology localization as being on the wane, but there is this data localization requirement. So I think the rule of thumb is, have a look if the technology, if it's sensitive, if it's personal, if you can identify people, probably that data will have to stay within China. And so there may be some duplication. So I don't know, let's say you're a weather, monitoring app or something or other. We've never done work for them, but just as an example, I could imagine, it would be important when you're doing your weather surveys, you want to collect information from all around the world. And that might be problematic in China because you may not be able to transmit Chinese satellite photos, or you might not be able to transmit certain extreme weather reports. I don't know if it is or it isn't. I'm just saying this would be something to look at. You might not be able to transmit that kind of information offshore, and your business model or your tech may work best if you get information from all over the place and build it up that way. I think, the next one will be if you're working with the data. Cybersecurity law is one of the few laws where the Chinese authorities do explicitly say that they have extraterritorial reach. So if you're a big company in China and you do something naughty from an offshore perspective, you might still get into trouble, So just be a little bit careful with data. I think data is a complex area. Business disruption, like a lot of companies monitor equipment remotely using real-time global data. Let's look at, let's say, cars, those autonomous cars, they probably, if you had, we don't do work for Ford, but let's say Ford was selling cars in China 10 years from now, probably all those cars are connected to the internet and the information is monitored to see if there's a problem, or if there is a problem, the Ford network will know. And, I could imagine that there'd be a global, data hub where all the information goes, and they use algorithms, to work out what your problem likely is, what kind of action you should take. So I think, the issue will be those things are difficult. Also, if you're doing an R&D project between, say, Germany and China, this can be difficult. If you're an IoT company, you might need to do a security assessment. You might need to get things checked. So I think if you're involved with data being transferred, you're going to have to look at it. If it's just an anonymized customer list or something, okay, it's easy. But you're going to have to look at how sensitive it is and what information's going where. Yeah. I think the last one about is whether they'll be forced to divulge information, and I don't know what's going to happen there. I think it's difficult to say there'll never be a problem, but I think we haven't really come across a client that's really given us in the last few years a very believable story that the Chinese authorities got the technology and passed it on to a local company. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I mean, I think, there is a risk of that happening. I just don't know how big the risk is. And so I think the question will be, how much do you have to disclose? What can you keep out of the disclosure? And what steps can you take to safeguard it? That's the issue.
Great. I have some questions, Mark. This is the last slide, but maybe we'll get to some questions because they're kind of relevant. Jack asks, what are the... Jack asks, what are the penalties for a data transfer breach? I guess the bigger question would be, what are the consequences for failing to, comply with some of the regulations? Are they just financial, or are they criminal? What kind of range are we looking at for these types?
Well, they've got big financial penalties. They've got big, I think it could also be criminal sanctions. Interestingly enough, the people that have been in trouble have been the big Chinese tech companies. So a lot of people were worried that they were going to hit, I don't know, foreign brands or foreign companies. But of course, if we're worried about data, it's not the foreigners who've got most of the data. It's the it's the big Chinese tech companies, and so they were the the first ones off the rank at the moment. So I guess that there are a lot of scary penalties, but yeah, so that's how that worked.
And one last question here from Cyrus again. All countries, quite rightfully so, are concerned about the export of their data as a means to build AI inventions that would pose national security issues and impede people's privacy. China is no different. An alternative is for international companies to work on local Chinese data in China. Therefore, data would not leave China. And an international algorithm enters China. I guess this is going to, what you mentioned earlier is that if there is some sensitive personal data, especially being collected onshore in China, that data should be stored onshore in China, and the cross-border transfer of that data is something that requires some type of audit, some type of system in place, so that there is some system in order to do that. Is that something you would agree with, Mark?
Yeah, I think so. So I think there's a few angles there, though. So it's always going to be a little bit more complicated. Normally, people say I see things too simplistically, but I think the issue will be, firstly, the transfer of the data. I think what Cyrus says is correct. It makes sense. They want to keep data. It would be hard for a Chinese company to buy a large, European company that has a lot of data on European citizens. Even if that data wouldn't be very interesting for anybody, it would just be difficult nowadays because of the use of AI and things like that. And likewise, China wouldn't be selling, masses of data to foreigners either. But I think the other issue is, even if the data stays within China and you've been bringing the algorithm to do it, I think on the one hand you'll be safe most of the time, and that will again cover probably 90% of the companies. But there's two issues, I think. First issue is, like I said, with the weather company, nobody really wants to go to an app that tells you this is what we think the weather was last week. So, it needs to be kind of real time. So whether you can have the luxury of, having two sets of data, and whether the foreign companies will, for the weather maps, I imagine Western countries don't care that much about that kind of technology. That'll be a question, whether technically it's feasible, if it's a real-time app, to do it and still be useful at all. Then the second question would be, is it affordable? Which you'd think, if it's a big enough market, you'd think China would be probably big enough to, afford something like that. But obviously it's going to be a bigger expense. But then the third issue is, like I mentioned, with iron ore or something like that, you'd have to be careful that the data you're dealing with is not sensitive or state data or state secrets. And that doesn't matter if you're dealing with it in China or overseas, you could still be in trouble. So, I don't know about iron ore. It's just because, mining companies have gotten into trouble in the past for state secrets when they're looking at the, the expected volume of iron ore, because that could affect the pricing. So I'm just using that as an example. But if you had some kind of fantastic algorithm that could predict what China would want to use on iron ore, you might get a visit from the state secrets department, and that may not be a very pleasant visit, So you have to be careful when you're dealing with anything sensitive.
Thanks a lot. We're out of time, but I just wanted to explain this last slide for everybody. These are real questions. We've gathered some of our resources here at the law firm, and we do have some questions that the authorities have asked clients about cybersecurity and data, and you can see the list over here to on the left here. So these are, you know, and like you said, Mark, this is not something that, you know, is just asked for the international companies. These are, you know, they're going to cut both ways. It's going to be the domestic Chinese companies, international companies, anybody that's handling data is going to have to answer, at least have some prepared answers for some of these questions. So this is just some FYI. And I think that about wraps it up here, Mark. So thanks a lot for sharing everything.
Okay, thanks, Sean.
Thanks everyone for watching, and I'll be sending along a copy of the presentation and a link to the recording in email. Thanks a lot. Take care, everybody.